Ahmedabad University. We are a research-based university, and we focus on interdisciplinary and experiential learning, and we focus on research thinking, and that is the uh, basis for our this kind of forum. We encourage these kinds of interdisciplinary forums, and conversation series is one such forum where we invite deep thinkers from policy, from academic background, and they engage with one of our in-house professor, and we have a discussion, and we also disseminate this information to people. So I welcome you to Ahmedabad University and to the conversation series again. I'm Sudhir Pandey. I'll do the quick introduction of today's guest, and then I'll hand it over to both the guests to begin the conversation. It is our absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Anirban Mahapatra. Dr. Anirban Mahapatra is an assistant director and publisher at the American Chemical Society, where he has been since 2007. His key accomplishments include the launch of several journals, several reputed journals, like some of them are ACS Chemical Neuroscience, ACS Medical Chemistry Letters, ACS Synthetic Biology. Under his direction, his team launched ACS Applied Biomaterial, ACS Applied Electronic Material, and Applied Energy Materials. Uh, he is currently responsible for the strategic development and management of American Chemical Society journals spanning physical, material, and biological chemistry. He is particularly fascinated by the changing landscape of how scientific information is disseminating globally. And he has been writing a lot in daily newspapers, in reputed newspapers, about COVID-19 and providing scientific information to people. So welcome, Anirban, and thank you so much for joining us. It is our pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me and for that wonderful introduction. I do have to say, I'm bound to say that all the opinions I expressed today are my own and not of my employer. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Uh, the person who will be in conversation with Anirban is Professor Pallavi Vyas. She holds a PhD in public policy from the Harris School of Public Policy, University of Chicago. Her fields of interest are labor economics, human capital theory, public health, and development economics. She is currently a consultant to the World Bank, where her projects involve calculating poverty rates for India using survey to survey imputation methods, establishing the relationship between anthropometric indicators for children and wealth measures as a evaluating medical cost to workers in the construction industry in the US. Prior to this, she has also worked as an economist in economic litigation consultant at Economic Analysis (LECG) in Los Angeles. Prior to joining economic analysis there, uh, she worked at the Milken Institute in Santa Monica as a research analyst to the president on global economic issues. So, welcome, Pallavi, and I request you to begin the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sudhir, and welcome, Anirban. Wish we could welcome you in Ahmedabad, but it's nice to have you online as well. So, let me start the slideshow. All right, all right. So we've been in this pandemic for 15 months now. And just as a broad question, why has this coronavirus been so difficult to deal with globally?
That's a great question. And again, thank you for having me on this wonderful discussion today. I saw in one of the earlier slides that a lot of people had selected local news as one of their sources for information in the poll that was made. So I've been on local news a couple of times, even in this past month, and my experience has been somewhat mixed in that I basically got to say a few things, and I was kind of reduced to a few sound bites, which didn't express the total nuances of the whole situation. So I do appreciate this type of a forum, and I think these types of discussions are more worthwhile to get at the nuances of what has been going on, as opposed to local news, which basically often also pits one person against another, one view against another, because it is a form of entertainment. So getting to your question, 15 months so far, what is it about this particular coronavirus and what is it about our response that makes it so deadly? So there are so many aspects of this, and I've covered some of this in my book, COVID-19, Separating Fact from Fiction. I'm not an expert in the behavioral aspects, the political aspects, which have played a major role in this pandemic. And I think the social, political, economic, and behavioral aspects were much more difficult to deal with than the scientific and medical aspects. And we're seeing this even now. But the medical and biological aspects of this virus also make it one that is difficult, in that a lot of people who are asymptomatic who are spreading this disease, so it made it very difficult to track. Early on, when it came out of, or the first cases were detected in Wuhan, it was very difficult to spot who, because of how the disease was being diagnosed, how it was being spread. So once these travel restrictions were underway, it had already spread to much of the world. And then the sort of heterogeneous manner in which this disease manifests itself from people. Fortunately, children are not very adversely affected. We still haven't figured that out. That is one of the open questions as to why children, because of their immunity or past infections with other coronaviruses, are not adversely affected. But just the sheer heterogeneity of the effects in people, from people who have no symptoms and are spreading to others, to people who have respiratory trouble, to people who have infections in other parts of the body and loss of smell and problems with taste, and then multiple organ failure and these adverse immune responses in people. So it started off as being, okay, COVID-19 is a respiratory disease. Then it became considered as this vascular disease. And now we know that it is this constellation of many diseases together, all in one, reflecting differently in different people and populations. And then apart from that, we have this thing called now this post-COVID sequelae, which is long COVID. And this is also being reflected in people who are clearing the virus, but not getting better. So that is one of the aspects of why we haven't been able to deal with it. And the second, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later, is the emergence of these variants. So people who got away or escaped the earlier waves are now being infected by these more infectious, more deadly, and immune escape variants. So all in all, this is not a virus that we have seen or in our lifetimes. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
So how does the virus spread? If you could tell us, like, does, it spreads, we know it spreads from, it's a zoonotic disease, it spreads from animals to humans, but now do the animals have to be sick? And does it spread from eating an animal, or does it, just being in close proximity to the animal makes humans acquire this kind of virus?
Yeah, it's a good question. We know a lot more about this in 15 months than we did, let's say, last January or even February. So yes, the original spillover was from an animal, most likely a bat at some point. Now, this is where I have to preface it with the various theories that have come out. And we know that this is common. I mean, there are other coronaviruses that have spilled over from bats. Even in this century, we had SARS in 2003, which came from bats through an intermediate animal called civets. Then there's MERS, which also came from bats, went to camels, and then is now infects people. So with SARS-CoV-2, the problem has been in identifying this original source of infection, because the coronaviruses that are in bats are slightly different, and we haven't sampled all of the viruses. We're still actually identifying new viruses. Even I wrote about this in Hindustan Times in my column this week. There are 2 new coronaviruses that actually infect humans, 2 novel coronaviruses. And one came from dogs, but has parts of a coronavirus from cats and other animals. And another one came from pigs. So all of these viruses are emerging over time. Now, what happened in this case is the coronavirus that came, SARS-CoV-2, it may have come from bats perhaps decades ago, and then had a low level of infection in people. And then suddenly in 2019, it became more infectious because of more mutations. So that's one theory. The second theory is that it spilled over into a secondary animal, and this might have been at the Huanan, the seafood market, or even before that at some point. And then it recombined like viruses tend to do. They mix and match parts, and then it became very, very infectious. That's a second theory. Now, the problem with the second theory is we haven't identified that intermediate animal, so we don't know that that's the case. The third one is what you're mentioning, is that there were some frozen samples of meat at the Huanan seafood market, and there have been some studies that showed that early on that spillover, so low probability chance, might have happened from frozen samples of some form of wild meat. So that's the third one. And the fourth one, which has found favor because of the intelligence agencies and some sort of, oftentimes not so much because of the science, but cannot be officially ruled out, is that there was some sort of lab leak of a virus that derived from bats. Now, once it was in humans and it was readily transmissible to humans, all of the transfer that we know since then is human to human. So it is not that it's spilling over from bats anymore. On the other hand, what we're actually seeing is that humans are transferring and transmitting to other animals. Like you're hearing about lions in zoos, leopards, minks. There are all these other animals, minks especially in Northern Europe, and other animals as well, are getting SARS-CoV-2 from humans, and we have to cull them. Otherwise, they will remain as reservoirs and come and reinfect us as well. So right now, the main transmission is human to human, and it's mostly by the aerosol route. So this is mostly by, early on, there was a lot of sort of sterilization and hygiene theater with cleaning surfaces. People were keeping their boxes outside. Somebody told me that they bought my book, but they left it outside for a week, which is completely unnecessary. And that level of hand washing, which has actually resulted in a lot of people having dermatitis because they were washing their hands so much, is now found to be like completely unnecessary. It doesn't spread that way. It is mostly human to human through an airborne route. And what that basically means is that we have to purify our air, and we have to make sure we don't share the same air with people of unknown infection status. So ventilation definitely is important, but also double masking wherever possible. So that's the main route nowadays. It's from people.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful, actually. Okay, so let me go down to my next question. So, we see on our screen, like, the wave really flattening for India, right? After September, October, like, we see the flattening of the curve. And like, it really felt rational to be able to socialize and vacation, and there was COVID fatigue, and people were thinking that now we're back to normal. But did any epidemiologist or virologist know about the possibility of a second wave, and were our authorities notified about that possibility at that time?
So I can't speak to the second point of how seriously authorities took it, because if you look at the more recent articles on the government and the supermodel that they put out, that basically they were a spectacular failure. Like the supermodel that the government relied on, all of that information is there. That's the beauty of the internet, is you can actually go back and see on a date-by-date basis what people were saying and what they believed. Yes, the first wave went down, but I think that anyone who was actually looking at what was happening in other countries at that time could have come to the rational judgment that the pandemic was not over. One wave does not make a pandemic. One swallow does not make a summer. Because if we look at, I mentioned this in my book at that time, we hadn't arrived at this current wave. But if we look at the countries that dealt with the pandemic well or were praised at that initial phase, Germany, Malaysia, a lot of these other countries, they faced a pretty devastating second wave. Malaysia is actually facing a wave right now. Part of it is due to the loosening of restrictions and fatigue, but part of it is due to the variants. And so by December, we knew of B117, which was the Kent variant, which came out in the UK. So we knew that something was going on. that they had to reimpose lockdowns, that this variant was more transmissible at that time. And in the US, where I currently live, it was sort of bizarre and absolutely surreal to see that we were still in lockdown at that phase. People were dying. In January, we were at about 300,000 cases a day. 5,000 people were dying every day. And my friends and family members, not to shame them, but they were actually attending weddings and traveling and vacationing at that time. And it did seem like in India that first wave was over. The problem with that approach is we don't even now know why that wave subsided. And so any cautious person would have said at that time, there were epidemiologists. So to answer your question, Dr. Brahma Mukherjee and others had said that we haven't reached that herd immunity threshold. And what we were seeing in terms of the sero surveys could not be extrapolated to all of India. You cannot take a sero survey of parts of Delhi or Dharavi and say that that applies to all of India. And I think that was probably a fatal flaw in reasoning. The other part is going back to when that first wave subsided. Because we didn't know why that first wave subsided, we were always susceptible to a reversal of that trend. And I mentioned that myself in January, is if you don't know why something goes away, then you cannot predict when and why it will come back. So I don't think anyone predicted that it would be at this level, because you don't know the intrinsic factors of how the government is going to respond, how people are going to respond. You don't know about like the Kumbh Mela and elections and things like that. And you don't know about the more infectiousness of the variant which arose. But so it turned out to be a tsunami instead of a wave. But I think people did predict a second wave.
And now what's on all our minds is, are we going to have a third wave? And what's going to prevent us from not having it? Because we'll do anything so that we can avoid it. At least I will.
Yeah, no, I know I think caution is very, very important. I think what our experience with the second wave and our continuing experience tells us is that we need humility and we need to be over-prepared as opposed to under-prepared. I think that's one of the lessons of the pandemic, and any type of response to an event of this nature is you cannot treat it like a cyclone or something that happens and then it goes away. As long as the virus is elsewhere and as long as variants can come, there can be adverse effects in the future. And the other thing is, if you over prepare and the worst case scenario doesn't pan out, then that's actually a good thing. So I think that's definitely what we want. The second wave is not over yet. And what some countries have noticed is that it doesn't always have a defined drop as well. I mean, for India, we're talking about one wave for India, but India is not really one homogeneous country. It's a large country. And so what we will see as a wave in, let's say, parts of Kerala or in densely populated areas is different from rural areas. So it is a collection of, if you will, a lot of waves that we're seeing. So you may actually see a sort of a narrower tail off, a shallower tail off of this second wave as opposed to a steep decline. And that is based on the measures that individual states take. Maharashtra's measures will be different from, let's say, West Bengal, which is seeing a drop right now because of lockdowns. Now, having said that, this wave will end because the variants will burn out. They will run out of people that are accessible through networks that they can immediately infect. And so that is why the wave will subside. There are also other factors that are responsible for declines of waves, and that some of them are actually environmental factors as well. I mean, we have seen waves for previous and other respiratory infections. The third wave, first of all, is not inevitable. It depends on a number of factors, including the rate and pace of vaccinations, which unfortunately have been very slow so far. And the second is how many people are accessible to the virus and its variants at that time. If you have a large number of people who are infected in the second wave, then the third wave does not have to be inevitable. And the other thing is like, what is the actual like amplitude and how big is that wave? If it's a smaller wave, then it may not be as problematic. There are some reports that really, I mean, a lot of people, scientists have been trying to dispel over the last few weeks. I don't know what the source of this was, is that children are going to get really adversely affected in this third wave. And this is actually mostly without basis, because as I mentioned at the start, one of the good things about this pandemic is, not about the pandemic, but about this virus, is that children are much less affected. So there's no reason to believe, unless there are new variants, that children will get more affected in a third wave.
Yeah, so let me go to my next question. When we talk about mutations, right, one thing that's puzzling is, why does the virus mutate in some geographic areas versus others? Like as of February, India had about 9,000 cases per day, while the US had a lakh or 100,000 cases per day. And now the situation has completely reversed, with India at like 190,000 cases per day and the US at about 28,000. So like, why didn't the virus mutate in the US? Why did it mutate in India?
Part of it is a very stochastic factor. Regardless of what I say, there is a large number of these events are basically random events, these mutations that happen. And so the evolutionary space you create is, if more people are infected, then there is more chance for mutations. Even if more of the mutations are, let's say most of the mutations are null or harmless or don't do anything. So we're only searching for the mutations that are harmful. So that's one point that I want to make, is that we are picking out the ones. So we are selecting for the ones, and we're throwing a flashlight on looking for things that are that have some sort of biological significance. And the rest of the, let's say the stochastic or the noise mutations, are not ones that we are looking for. So that's the broader context. So the more people that get infected, the more space it has, because every single time the virus copies, it makes mistakes. And so more people get infected for longer durations of time, then more mutations will happen. But the other aspect of it is, the more that you look for mutations, the more that you will find. It's the same with testing. One could say that a country that has not tested anyone does not have the virus, but that's not true. If you test for more, you'll catch more virus. So similarly, if you sequence more, then you will likely pick up more variants. And I think India picked up a variant late. And one thing maybe we'll talk about is that our genomic surveillance and sequencing has not been as much as it should have been to be able to catch up and find these. So the US found a lot of variants. The variants that arose in the US, let's say the New York one, a couple out of California, which are actually have some mutations similar to the one that came from Maharashtra, have not spread as much. Now, the variant that came from the UK, B117, was highly transmissible, but it was also found because the UK does much more per capita sequencing than any other country. So they were able to identify it more rapidly. The other sort of point is that we are using convalescent plasma indiscriminately. And one of the research studies by Dr. Ravi Gupta at Cambridge and a number of other scientists have found that some people cannot clear the virus. So these are not people who are having infections for 5 or 6 days. You give them convalescent plasma, they don't clear the virus, and they have these chronic infections for over 100 days because they are immunocompromised people. So think about it, if the virus spreads for over 100 days in one single person, and they're shedding that virus over 100 days, now that virus is mutating and getting a number of mutations. So these are these very specific cases of where these variants of concern are rising. And we haven't traced this in India, but I'm pretty damn sure that this is also what's happened because of the use of convalescent plasma in people who have not been clearing the virus. So all of these reasons are why these variants are appearing. And I don't know what set of factors led to B1617 and B16172 in India, but it was the worst possible variant at the worst possible time for India. So it was a double whammy for us.
Okay, so you said that like California had a very similar virus, a similar mutation, right? But how were they then able to stop it? Was it through genome sequencing? Like, can genome sequencing allow you to curtail the virus? I mean, is it because you're just more aware that it exists and then you can take the right steps in that direction?
Yes, it is. You are more aware that it exists and you can take. And then what happens is over time, because these are, let's say, these are all variants that are competing against each other. One variant that is either more transmissible or can escape is going to basically rise and take over. This happened last year. There was one D614G, one variant. So most people don't know that the virus that came out of Wuhan was actually gone by the middle of 2020. It had been replaced by D614G. And then now this year in the US, all the infections that are happening are actually the UK variant because it spreads more. So what I think happened is when the UK variant got imported to the US, then it outcompeted and basically was more transmissible than even the California variant or the New York variant. And now what we're seeing in the UK is the variant that probably came from India, B6172, is now outcompeting. So in terms of transmission, the variant that we have in India, B617 and B6172, are probably the worst to deal with because they are spreading everywhere now. And so that's unfortunate. So even if that variant comes to the US, it will outcompete the ones that we have here in the US because it is the most transmissible that we've identified today. So it's basically a question of the fitness of each variant and how well it can do vis-a-vis the other variants.
So can you spend a minute on telling us how these variants even come about? Like how did it arise? Like, do you have to have some coronavirus in you and then you create a new variant? I mean, can you tell us? We're a non-science
Yes.
group. Yeah.
Yes, I actually have a slide that maybe I want to show. I'm going to share my screen just to show this one slide. So I was putting together some slides just to discuss. So what happens when the virus basically, when the virus enters the body, the virus is inside the body. There are thousands, maybe millions of types of this virus inside the body. And when it's inside the body, it has this spike protein, which is jutting out, and that gives it the corona-like appearance for the coronavirus. And it's randomly crashing against various types of cells. Now it finds the receptor that it can recognize, this ACE2 receptor, the ACE2 receptor. And what happens here is that it has a handshake with, so this is let's say the hand of the virus and the hand of the cell that was sticking out, and there's a handshake. Now the handshake can be sort of like this loose handshake, or it can be a very tight handshake. Mutations that make the handshake stronger. So I have this diagram here. And what that basically shows is that if you have a stronger handshake, because of these random events that happen, stronger handshake means that the virus can probably get into cells better. And so while it's mutating and that's happening, that is one type of variant that now becomes more transmissible. So what is the result in terms of people is that that person might have more viral load, or they might be more infectious. So let's say in a family, one person was getting infected and the other three weren't. Now with a more transmissible variant, you could have all four people getting infected. Or it could be requiring fewer number of virus particles to enter. Let's say 200 virus particles would enter and it would cause infection. Now you have 100 virus particles enter. So all of these things are happening at a molecular level, but they're having these effects on transmission.
So when it handshakes, when it with something else in your body, the receptor in your body, right? Is that the
yeah.
Right. So then how does it convert? Like now, how does the regular coronavirus become the 617.2? Like how does that happen?
Yeah. So this is a process that is happening all the time. So we tend to think of, even in our bodies, like when we have cancer, it's basically mutations. So mutations are basically a fancy word that biologists use to indicate any type of change. The virus itself, when it makes copies, it has a copier. Let's say it has a copier that's not high fidelity. It has a very sloppy and poor copier that inserts changes and mistakes. So those mistakes are random mistakes. There are, let's say, thousands of mistakes. Nobody cares about them. And the ones that that don't help the virus, let's say a weaker handshake or a similar type handshake, are not helping it, so they are not selected. The one that's stronger is more powerful, and so that is the one that gets selected.
Thank you for that. That was really helpful. Uh, so in India itself, right, we see that we see a considerable variation across states. Like we see it, the virus is very prominent in Maharashtra, in Bombay, in the metropolises, in Kerala. But then, it's very prevalent in rural Maharashtra, but not in rural Gujarat, and then not in rural Rajasthan. So, is there some explanation for that? Why is that the case?
There are lots of explanations, but like so many things with this, I don't have a favorite hypothesis yet. One is definitely population density. With any respiratory virus that is airborne, you have a lot of people, let's say, who cannot socially distance, who are in close physical proximity in a place, then you will have more transmission. That is just a fact of life, that in rural areas. The other is another aspect of ventilation, where we have like cities where there's a lot of air conditioning and people were not aware of the airborne spread early on. So I think they were sharing, and we were seeing this even in housing societies where people thought that they were isolated, but the ventilation systems are all connected. So when one person was getting infected, a lot of other people were. This is not the case in rural areas. In rural areas, they have a lot more houses are spread further apart. But I think it is also a factor of the amount of testing and the amount of identification of true positives. I think a lot of places in rural areas, like you mentioned, Odisha, in parts of West Bengal. I know people in parts of rural Bengal who have symptoms of COVID-19. Some of them have actually passed away, but because they didn't have the true confirmatory test for COVID-19, that disease, their death is being coded as something else. Part of it is actually also due to this stigma, even now associated with getting identified as being a COVID positive patient. And some people will actually take their chances instead of getting tested. I think that's more of a behavioral rural phenomenon, as opposed to in the cities now, where people want to get tested, they want to get treated, and they want to get better. So I think a lot of these factors play a role. But then finally, there's also the network effects as well. I think there is some dispersion into quote unquote the hinterlands, but not as much. And maybe that's where, if there is a third wave, that's where parts of India will get affected adversely.
All right. So let's ask you some questions on vaccines. Can you explain to us the difference between the vaccines and how effective they are against the variants? Obviously, a lot of our Indian population has got the vaccines that were not tested on the variant. So we're obviously worried, are these going to be effective against these new mutant strains?
This is a fantastic question, and I can talk about this for an hour or two, but I will try to keep it as brief as possible. And the short answer to this is all the vaccines are effective against all the known variants right now. That's the short and sweet answer. The question becomes more complicated when we look at individual vaccines and their efficacy and what they were tested against and what effective actually means in populations of different people who will have different immune responses. So immune system is beautiful, but it's extremely complicated and it consists of many parts. And all of these vaccines are not equally adept at getting the same response of the various arms of the immune system. Now, what I will say right now is based on what we know, especially in the Indian context with B1617, and I wrote about 3 pieces on this. So there are 2 in Mint and 1 in Hindustan Times. It looks like there is a lowered amount of immunity, but the immunity that we have from the vaccines available in India is adequate after 2 doses. So that's the key point that we want to make. Full protection after 2 doses is adequate to prevent severe disease. And that's what we want. When you lose this immunity to a vaccine, the way that it goes is first you lose the ability to prevent infection and transmission, then mild disease, then moderate disease, and then severe disease goes away. So what we obviously want is we want to protect people from going to the hospital and dying. So you start from that end. And so far, what we know is because of the combined response of the immune system, these vaccines are protective, will keep you out of the hospital by and large, and will prevent you from getting the most severe cases of COVID-19. So that's the short answer.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So on some other research that isn't clear, I think the jury is still out on whether it's safe for pregnant women to take the vaccine or not. And also, the question on the blood clots with respect to the AstraZeneca vaccine. So a lot of Indians have been nervous about taking AstraZeneca and have been, leaning towards Covaxin because of the information on the AstraZeneca clot issue that came up. But of course, then the other issue is that Covaxin has not been actually certified by the global community. So people are worried about that as well. So any kind of light that you can shed on these issues?
Yeah, this is a situation where there hasn't been that much clarity. And I saw somebody actually asked a question about the intervals as well. There have been a lot of questions that have come up with respect to, first of all, the vaccines that are available, the interval, the gap between the vaccines that's been changing. It's been a sort of a sliding scale for Covishield in particular. Mixing and matching vaccines, which there hasn't been great guidance on, and some conflicting messages right now. Who can get the vaccines and be safe? You mentioned pregnant women and others. With Covishield and AstraZeneca, the risk for these blood clots, these rare blood clots, seems to be highest in women under 50. So other countries, Germany, UK, that have other vaccines have recommended that those high-risk people or higher risk people take a different vaccine as opposed to that. But the vaccines are available, they are safe, and they are being provided to everyone else. So what has happened in small children, there was a trial for the AstraZeneca Covishield equivalent vaccine, but that's actually now been stopped because of the blood clot risk. What they found is because, as I mentioned, children have a very low risk of the worst outcomes from COVID-19, that the risk was actually balancing out with these blood clots. So they ended that trial. There are other trials for other vaccines underway. Covaxin has one, and then the mRNA vaccines do as well. Yeah, so I would say that if you have a particular case where, well, first of all, get vaccinated. The risk of vaccines is, in any case, is still much, much lower than the risk of what might happen if you have COVID-19. Not just the risk of death, but the risk of long COVID and everything else. The second thing is discuss with your physician if you have a particular case of you're being immunosuppressed or pregnant, or you have a particular risk factor. But definitely, if there are 2 vaccines, so get vaccinated.
Right. Thank you for that. Now, what we're all facing in the metropolises is an acute vaccine shortage, right? So the question is, like, how long does it take from placing an order to the vaccine finally reaching the consumer? And how do we understand these shortages that we're facing, right? This is a little humor in a very dark time, and a very, serious issue that we're facing with these shortages.
This is an incredibly important question and an incredibly important issue for not just 2021, but 2022. And there is a perspective that you can take of a community, of a country, and a global perspective. These vaccines work. They were created in a record amount of time, I think 11 months, and production and manufacturing processes of these vaccines started even before they were approved, which is absolutely unheard of. I mean, most vaccines take anywhere, the shortest is 5 years, but most take 10 to 15 years because you go through the process of development and then manufacturing. So manufacturers took the risk at cost to be able to create these vaccines even before we knew they were effective and even before we knew that they were safe. So that is a risk that they took to begin the manufacturing process before that. Some of these vaccine manufacturing platforms are also absolutely new. Like we haven't had this virus vector platform or these mRNA vaccine platforms rolled out at scale during a pandemic to billions of people. So that had never happened before. So even the manufacturing plants had to be created at scale to be able to do this. The unfortunate piece of this is, like, we were all very proud that India is going to produce 60% of the world's vaccines or more. We have all the world's vaccine manufacturers, but the orders were actually not made in time to be able to scale up, for India in particular. One of the things that, even though the United States had an absolute debacle last year with the virus, is that because of Operation Warp Speed, they did actually negotiate with the vaccine manufacturers to buy, in case even a few of them didn't work, they were covered multiple times over with all of the vaccine manufacturers. And so this is basically a case where India did not do that even until January. And then everyone knows about the issues with the regulators and not even allowing Pfizer in after it had been proven in other countries and asking for bridging trials. So a whole bunch of things went into why India in particular did not have the vaccines, even though the vaccine manufacturing base was there. And this has downstream effects on the whole world, because the whole world is relying on COVAX, not the rich countries that negotiated directly, but they are relying on COVAX, and Serum Institute of India has contracts to provide vaccines through COVAX to the rest of the world. And so vaccinations have ground to a halt, not just in India, where it's slow, but not to a halt, but in other parts of the world. There are parts of the world right now where less than 1% of the population has been vaccinated at all. Low-income countries, parts of Africa. Africa has almost no manufacturing base and capability of making vaccines, has not received vaccines. And this inequality is contrasted with the US, where now a 12-year-old can go in and get vaccinated just without an appointment. It's just a walk-in. Low-risk groups in this country, in the US, can get vaccinated, whereas high-risk groups and physicians and other people in other parts of the world who have comorbidities and might even die if they get disease, they can't get vaccinated. So a whole bunch of factors here. And it's like, basically the problem is you're trying to scale up in the middle of a pandemic, trying to create more of a scarce resource, which was going to be scarce to begin with. Sorry, I gave a really long answer to that.
No, that was great. That was great. And I have a follow-up answer, a question, but let us get through these questions that we thought about before, so that we can let the audience ask their questions as well. Okay, now, we're dealing with this, like a large population that is scared of getting vaccinated in India. Right? So in some states like Jharkhand, we have huge amounts of vaccine wastage, while in the metropolises, we face this shortage, right? And with the pervasive use of the cell phone, information for millions of Indians now comes from non-verified sources, right? Are there any ideas on how best to compete with these sources of information so that individuals are led to believe more in scientific truths. Of course, cable TV is out of the reach of a large, very high risk population. So what do we do to combat this fear? And I think India is not alone. There are other parts of the world that are also hesitant to take vaccines. And like California and Ohio have these incentive programs where they're trying to get, they're paying people to get vaccinated. So any ideas you have on what we can do?
Yeah, this scenario is slightly different in the US and in Western countries where the standard of living has increased due to vaccination. And now they have these concerted disinformation campaigns of vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaxxer movements trying to get people not to get vaccinated. We don't in India have that kind of a movement. What we have is basically lack of information and fear and lack of outreach, as you mentioned, and these so-called WhatsApp forwards that are moving around from everywhere, misquotes, half-truths, things like that. Part of the problem is that there is not much universal, well, there is no universal adult vaccination in India. The only times, and I wrote about this for Mint regarding vaccine hesitancy, the only time that my friends in India or I got vaccinated was either the tetanus vaccine or the rabies shot if somebody was unfortunately bitten. There is no annual flu shot. Nobody ever actually gets that. So while childhood vaccination is universal, adult vaccination is not very common in India. So we were already starting from that base of lack of awareness and lack of knowledge. And I have to say there has absolutely been no outreach to people to actually convince them to get vaccinated at all. There has been communication regarding a subset of people who want to get vaccinated and telling them, and who have access to the CoWIN app and can get on that app. But what about all the people that you mentioned in Jharkhand who don't have that app or who don't want to get vaccinated or don't know about the threat of COVID-19? So there had to have been that second route of communication from trusted official sources to that group of people in their native languages. And I'm sorry to say that that hasn't happened at all. And we're seeing the effects of that. And into that void, we have this ecosystem of misinformation coming from WhatsApp and Facebook and all of these other places where people are, and people, you can give them all the data they want. They will see their neighbors and their friends and they'll see that. They'll see, like, if one person gets vaccinated and is fine and they'll share that in the WhatsApp group, then everybody will be. I saw that in my own family as well. Like, if one person got vaccinated, everybody else is like, okay, this is fine. Now we can do it. So I guess that is what needs to happen.
Right. There's, for some reason, that a lot of the people that I know, who work around here, they said that someone died. Like they said, mar jate hain vaccine ke saath. So they've heard that and it's come through some forward, and now everyone is petrified. They don't want to be that one person that dies,
Yeah, and that is problematic. I mentioned this in a different context, that basically this is where news and a broader perspective is different. Like when we look at data, when you look at data, or when I look at data, we always look at the numerator and the denominator, and we try to put it into the context of what is going on. But news is not like that. The news is never talks about all the planes that landed. They always have to talk about the single plane that crashed. And they don't have the time to go through and discuss why that happened. So we don't know of the millions of people, the 1 billion people who have been vaccinated in the world, only few of them have actually, and it's unfortunate, but only few of them, and nobody is asking that question. Instead, they are forwarding these tweets about everyone will die 2 years from now, absolutely unsubstantiated things. And part of that is that problem, is basically the lack of putting these numbers into context of like, okay, so one person died. What did they die of? It's not also that they died of vaccination. It's like, just because something happened after something doesn't mean it happened because of that thing. And there is no follow-up. And I think the broader thing is that we haven't inculcated that level of critical thinking, where it's basically a knee-jerk reaction to something.
That's right. Yeah. So, like, is COVID-19 gradually decreasing its stronghold over most nations? And will it eventually disappear?
COVID-19 is never going to be eradicated. The word disappear is a difficult one to answer, but it's never going to get eradicated just for the sheer number of people that have been infected, the way that it can mutate. It can infect other animals and stay on. It will infect different parts of the world variably. And the high threshold of the number of people who have to get vaccinated for it to just basically disappear is not there. So it is going to stay with us. And then the other thing to remember is that we have like millions of children are born every year. Newborns will always be susceptible to this disease. So there is an immunologically naive population that is being born every year. Parts of the world that have been vaccinated will start to resume normal life, and other parts of the world that have not been vaccinated or have not been infected might suffer for a longer term. So we will see the variability in parts of the world resuming normal life earlier, and other parts of the world facing this for many months and for many years. So it will become, instead of being an equal threat everywhere, it will be an uneven threat in different parts of the world. Over time, though, I think after vaccination and infection have occurred, even if there are secondary waves of infection, it will become less severe. It will become mild. And so the ideal scenario is that a few years from now, COVID-19 becomes this mild cold-like disease like the other cold-causing coronaviruses, where basically it's not a disease of adults, it's a mild self-limiting disease of children, and definitely not a pandemic-causing disease. So even though it doesn't go away, it's no longer as severe as it is right now.
Okay, so the key is vaccination. We just have to
Key
get
is
as many
absolutely.
people vaccinated as possible. All right. So we're exactly at the 6 o'clock mark. Sudhir, do you want to open up the chat room right
Yeah,
now?
we have a lot of questions and there are people waiting.
Right.
So I would like to go with the first question that Aniket Navalkar asked, and I will ask on his behalf. And then there are people who will come on camera and ask, so I request them to see if they can unmute. So Aniket asked, why are the assumptions of conventional epidemiological models not sufficient to model the spread of virus? Also, what is the scope of a network approach over the standard approach of modeling of the spread of COVID-19?
So I will preface my answer by saying that I am not an epidemiologist by training. So if I do overstep my areas of expertise, then please do let me know. My understanding of this from having read the models and papers on this, there was a paper published in Science last year when this pandemic was happening, is that most of the models that had been created had been done with influenza and expecting an influenza pandemic. So even if you look at Neil Ferguson's model or some of the other influential MRC models, they were basically an pandemic influenza model that had changed parameters and were retrofitted with coronavirus. And the coronavirus is obviously different. It has different epidemiological parameters. We didn't know about seasonality. That's the second factor. Like if you remember last year, people were saying it may go away in the summer. What is the effect of humidity? We didn't know any of those. So we were starting from a place of not having faced a pandemic with this particular kind of virus and with these parameters. And so basically in a model, it depends on what your assumptions are. And so a lot of the assumptions were wrong or were unknown. And when you fit those into a model, they don't necessarily come out right. Some have been actually better. Like I remember there was a paper in Science that basically said how many waves will occur. The other couple of things that I will mention is that nobody had modeled for the variants. That's another thing. And nobody knew if vaccines would work and the pace of vaccinations. So you have all of these factors that go into this. And last but not least is how do you actually model for human behavior? That must be very difficult.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now I would like to invite our colleague, Professor Vivek Tanawade, to unmute himself and ask a question.
Thank you, Sudhir.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah. I have two questions, if two short ones, if time permits. The first is we spoke about the warning to the authorities, and was there a warning that was given? And this is a related question. So the challenge is really transmitting and translating scientific information while policy making. And I would argue that India is not the only country to not do that very effectively. Many countries, including the United States, last year were in a similar situation. So there is a challenge here in terms of taking scientific information and transmitting it and translating it for the policymakers, where this can actually be used in effective interventions. And so I would like to ask to what extent or how do you think that this challenge can be solved?
That is an excellent question, and I agree with you completely. I did not mean or did not want to indicate that India was unique in this, because when we saw all of the other countries and even the ones that I mentioned in my book, that basically you could see even last year, you could map the pandemic was spreading from the virus was spreading from one country to another and creating these mass outbreaks. Well, if you looked at the local news, it was very localized. There was not much focus. There was some focus, okay, it's happening over there. And the first wave went away, and then most countries also had that type of issue. I think the bigger challenge around that is also like there are so many factors that are involved in this. If you take an intervention, when do you actually translate from that science to policy? When do you make that decision? Because there are so many lives. There are more than 1 billion people's lives at stake here, and we saw some of the effects of that first lockdown and what happened and the negative reaction that it got. I'm not a behavioral scientist, but I do think some people should also look at the reactions to that first lockdown and how they might have influenced the hesitance to actually come to terms or even implement some of the measures that might have been necessary during that second, because it was very sharp and very almost unequivocal in the response that came to that first set of lockdowns and things like that. And a lot of people said, well, it didn't work, it wasn't necessary, we didn't have to do anything, we are past the pandemic, and that sort of set in. So it's not just the complacency, but I think that past experience, how that influenced the current set of measures in it, I think that needs to be examined, and I don't have the answer to that.
So you need to unmute.
Yeah, no, I was able to do it now. I didn't realize that if I mute myself, I couldn't unmute. Yeah. So the second related question is, to what extent do you think our lack of experience of dealing with such pandemics, and when I say our, it means the entire world again, has led to its spread? So if you look at countries that went through rather severe bouts of pandemic earlier, so if you look at SARS, if you look at swine flu, countries in Southeast Asia, for example, they seem to have done better in dealing with the current pandemic, and maybe because the people there had experience on how to deal with this, or they had gone through this, and so it was easier, for example, for people to comply. So if the government said stay at home, people would do that willingly because they had gone through this earlier, and so they understood the repercussions of this. So as a corollary, do you think that next time we get a next pandemic, uh, we would be better prepared to deal with it because of our experience of the current one?
I absolutely agree with both points that you made. The first point is actually also in my book, that if you look at countries that you mentioned that had dealt with SARS, like if you or regions of the world, Hong Kong, Korea, other parts of the world, parts of East Asia, they dealt with it much, much better than the Western world, where in general, infectious diseases are no longer a threat as they are in other parts of the world. So that's the primary thing. The second thing is masking. Masking became such an ideological issue when it was a scientific one in the country that I'm in, the United States, where people even now, 15 months later, still refuse to mask, even though it will save their lives and the lives of their others. So I guess the point to make from that is that the next time something happens, masking has become normalized now. I think nobody will in any, and I feel comfortable masking, whereas before it was sort of this oddity of like, why is this person masking? Now we know all about that. So I think we would be prepared from that perspective. I think there will be more funding for drugs and vaccines, even in the inter-pandemic years, to be able to, now that we've identified it's okay, coronaviruses are a threat, we were caught without a large number of drugs. And even now, if you look at like the drugs that are being used, none of them are ideal for coronaviruses. So I think there will be more drugs available. I think there is research programs underway to actually create pan-coronavirus and pan-influenza virus vaccines that will work against broad spectrum, so we can stop this, and definitely more surveillance as well. So yes to both of your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite one of our students to ask a question to Durga. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So I'd asked this question in the chat box as well. So the question is that the gap between Covishield vaccination has been increasing, and it is always when there's a shortage happening of Covishield. So is it a logistic reason or a scientific?
So the main reason, well, definitely it's a logistic reason. The first and foremost is there are not enough vaccines, and this is we cannot sugarcoat it. That's the same reason why the UK did it, and the UK, after they did it, a research paper came out in the Lancet that had pooled a number of different studies and said that if you increase the gap between the two vaccines, then it results overall in a higher efficacy later on. And from a scientific perspective, it does sort of make sense, because if you can think of what the prime and the boost does, you can think of it as, let's say the prime gets the immune system ready and the boost kicks it off. So imagine now you have a plane that is going on the runway. So it's going on the runway, it actually gains speed, and then the boost is when it actually takes off. It gets more fuel, and then it increases its acceleration, and then it takes off. The problem is if you don't boost, then after some time it will run out of fuel. And you are also not fully protected in that interval. And that's something that has come to light with, especially with the variant 1617. So there has been mixed messages, but the main reason I think is lack of vaccines.
Okay. Thank you, Durga. There is a question by Tanisha Nag, and I request Tanisha to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hi, really great session so far. I just wanted to ask something that you mentioned that
I think her connection is
like
not...
a wave and the possibility of it, like how environmental factors also. So could you just like, hello, am I audible?
Yeah. Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, so we lost you for a second. So if you can repeat your question quickly.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, stuck again.
Yeah, so I will read her question. She's saying that you said a wave.
So
there seems to be some connection problem, Tanisha. So can I read your question if it is okay?
yes, sir, please. I don't know what's the issue. I think the internet problem.
No problem. She's saying that you said a wave is linked to environmental factors. Could you elaborate a bit on this? What are these environmental factors? Could you have like environmental stressors such as air pollution contributing to such a wave?
I sorry.
Yeah, so the question was about environmental factors and the rise and fall of waves. A lot of this has been studied for other respiratory viruses. So that's, I guess, the caveat that we have to start with. But what we see with influenza is seasonal influenza and both pandemic, slightly different, but they also have waves. And seasonality, that is basically, we have a flu season, right? That is for the seasonal flu. And a lot of that is due to a number of factors with respect to transmission, such as humidity. Low humidity means there's greater transmission. Temperature also, and then people being more in indoors, especially in colder climates. 90% of our time is indoors and spent in that area. So those are some of the factors. I don't think people have looked at the effect of air pollution, but it's definitely something that they should take a look at.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite Sanjay to unmute and ask his question.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for this insightful talk. Because I still feel like a common person, no, when I look at these virus issues. When lockdown happened, I was so scared, thinking that if I go out, the virus will somehow find me and jump like a tiger. Okay, and then later on, it become very clear that okay, it comes to air, human to human transmission, and there were a lot of WhatsApp university saying what should be done. So till today, I keep on actually cleaning all the things I get at my home, and somehow I saved me and my family. And April I got infected. I don't know how it is, but it was mild cold and we could survive. So then we thought of taking vaccination. And also my question is that what is the possibility that person will get reinfected maybe seriously because it was mild, and after recovering this, so will it be the same mutant might not be able to impact, or there if another mutant come, then will it be able to impact that person? And how long this antibody will actually last that we can still fight with anything? And do you think that we'll move to herd immunity given the our population and the vaccination rate? So will it be going towards herd immunity after some time?
So yeah, a lot of questions regarding immunity post infection. The good news is that some of the studies that have looked at reinfections, there was one I think out of Qatar that showed that reinfection rates were very, very low. What you're asking about are mutants that might arise, the so-called immune escape mutants that the antibodies don't recognize as well. You will still have one part of your immune system that prevents the severe disease. And that's like, regardless of how the virus mutates in the future, you will have some protection. So that will protect you against severe disease. That's the same with the vaccines. When I mentioned that vaccines work against variants and they will work against future variants, they will have this subset of the cell-based immunity that will prevent that. So your chance of, so compared to someone who has not been infected, if you do a head-to-head, because you have been infected once, your chance of being infected is lower. Your chance, if you get infected, of being hospitalized is also lower. And what we know now is that antibodies remain for up a year, perhaps even longer. And we don't have years of data yet. So I guess that's the broader view right now. But having said that, since you've been infected once, if you can get vaccinated, please do get vaccinated, because the immunity from the vaccination is actually, they're saying, even higher than that for some of the vaccines than actual natural infection.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions about herd immunity as well. And there was also a question I also asked and one of the colleagues that how long this immunity lasts. So can you tell us something on this about herd immunity? Because there were a lot of talk initially as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of talk around that was using that herd immunity as a strategy, and that now seems to not be the case. And as we see these variants, people are saying the threshold is 60 to 70%. Some scientists are saying, you may have seen this, that we may never reach the complete herd immunity threshold, that they will remain a susceptible population. That doesn't mean that the rate of infections doesn't decline. I mean, the rate of infections may decline to a certain level, and but ultimately, I think vaccinations are what going to, yes. So after a substantial proportion of the population has been vaccinated, then we could reach some of those higher thresholds. But I think the recent calculation is like 90% of the adult population has to be vaccinated with the new variants that are more transmissible to reach herd immunity, which seems unlikely.
Okay, thank you. I would like now to invite Professor Jimo Lunni to ask a question. She has a question. Ma'am, can you please unmute?
Hi.
Oh.
So, hi Pallavi and hi Anirban. That's a very fascinating discussion. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know we can only understand that much. So I was just wondering whether there is is there a real difference between the, the traditional way of making this vaccine, the efficacy or the efficiency, whatever is the terminology that you use, for this, the AstraZeneca kind of vaccine and the new one, the mRNA vaccine. Is there really that much of a difference? And for the immediate context, our daughter and son-in-law in London have just gone in to get this vaccine, and she reports that she's getting the Pfizer mRNA. So does that make her safer than us who got this Covishield business?
Again, all of this is like the safety aspect is completely relative, and it's like so much luck based. And this efficacy trials are also, they were not compared head to head. So I will just say that my mother, she's fully vaccinated. She got the AstraZeneca Covishield. I got the Pfizer one here, the mRNA vaccine as well in the US. So all vaccines work, all vaccines are good. Mm-hmm. With that said, these mRNA vaccines are a new class of vaccines that have what are super immunity because of not just the way that they were designed, but the immune response that they elicit and the amount of antibodies, especially against the variants, that they seem to be, the two mRNA vaccines are a class above all of the other vaccines, so simply put. That's a scientific fact. And the rest about vaccinations is also true, that, I mean, all vaccines work, but those two are really amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. There is a question by Professor Sonal Yadav, if she can unmute and ask a question.
Hello, hi. Very insightful conversation, Anirban and Pallavi. My question is a bit controversial. But I'm asking because I want your opinion on that. So my question is, what do you think of virus being made in lab? Because initially this was outrightly rejected, but now US President and Dr. Fauci has asked government to look into this matter. So.
Yeah, I don't think there's, I don't think it is a controversial question. And I just don't think it's like there is no data to be, so I guess when we say that all possibilities are likely, we have to think of like which is more likely and which is less likely. So we cannot rule out that there was lab escape. I think the likelihood that it was made in a lab is lower because you would have to know what you are making. And while that's possible, that would have to be like the most devious and the most smartest person in the world to know at that point what they were making. So again, that's the likelihood is lower. Did it escape from a lab? Likelihood is higher. But what we've seen is that if you go based on simply the statistics of how many coronaviruses have jumped from animals into humans, how many coronaviruses exist, and how many coronaviruses mix and match and jump into people like this, then just simply based on Occam's razor, likelihood of those is higher. So from a scientific perspective, like I said, it's not controversial. We cannot rule it out, but the political statements are not scientific data, and there is no data in favor of that yet. The World Health Organization had a team that visited, And they did give a recent interview. They will be going back and looking at a lot of these other labs and things like that. But yeah, everything that they're saying is absolutely circumstantial. Like, okay, somebody got sick, was in a hospital. That doesn't really mean anything. Anyone can be sick and in a hospital. So we're still waiting for the scientific data.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. There is a question by one of our students, Lucky. He's asking, can you tell about mucormycosis and why has it raised its head in India, particularly these times?
Yeah, this is sort of almost like an unfortunate situation in the middle of an unfortunate situation. Mucormycosis, which is this black fungus, is from this family of ubiquitous fungi that are everywhere, especially in humid climates like in India. And they have spores that are in the air also. They don't normally affect a person who is healthy. So even if you are breathing in those spores, which we all are in humid climates, it doesn't affect people. But it does seem to be closely associated with people who have been given steroids and who have uncontrolled diabetes. And so their blood sugar is high for either of these reasons. And in that case, what happens is the fungus seems to penetrate and invade other cells and have this upper hand. What the epidemiology of this and what the other mitigating factors are right now are not known, but it does seem to be affecting India more and affecting in the second wave, definitely much more. So steroid use and incidence in people who have uncontrolled diabetes seem to be the two main factors.
Okay, thank you. There is a question by Neelab Shrivastava. He's asking that there has been a paper recently co-authored by Florian Kramer and others on providing single dose of mRNA vaccines to COVID survivors. Do we have any similar findings regarding the current vaccines being administered in India? Any?
That is a great question. And Professor Florian Kramer is one of the leading immunologists in the world. So what he is saying is sort of a follow-on to the question that was asked earlier. It's like somebody who has already been infected once has the equivalent of the prime. Let's say that's the equivalent of the first dose. And you give them, instead of 2 doses, when there is a scarcity, you give them just 1 dose, and that acts as a boost. And that work has been done for an mRNA vaccine. It's quite possible that it's likely for other vaccines as well, that they will have full protection after just 1 dose of vaccine. However, I think that is like from a logical perspective, that makes sense, but we don't have the clinical data yet. But yes, that's a great question, and it's likely.
Okay. I would like to ask one last question, and then I'll hand it over to Pallavi. What will, as a scientist, you know the kind of scientific basis, what will be the future after this? Whenever this ends, how do you kind of predict based on your understanding?
Future is extremely hard to predict. And I think some things are much broader and very difficult to figure out. Like basically, what will be the future of work? Like what will be the future of the disparities that we have with me being able to. So one thing that I had mentioned to Amit Verma in the Seen and the Unseen podcast, which I will mention here, is that in some ways the timing of this pandemic was that we were able to, for a certain segment of the population, immediately pivot to working from home and doing these types of meetings by Zoom. So for us, it was difficult, but we didn't skip a heartbeat in that sense. But for people in the informal economy, and I'm the least expert here among all the people in this aspect, but I think that's going to be like, basically they have to survive in the mode of the pre-pandemic mode. And so I think a lot of people will be very eager to forget everything that happened and go back into a normal form of life. And whether people move away from cities, that has been hypothesized. Maybe that will happen in certain countries, but the economic opportunities are still by and large in the urban areas. So I don't see that being a major factor. Some things I think will happen, like basically more wearing of masks and all of these things, but those are sort of more superficial things. I don't know about any bigger major upheaval to society.
Okay, thank you. Now I request Pallavi to close this,
Yeah.
and if
So
you have
can
any
I,
final remarks.
yeah, since we have a couple of minutes, can I ask a question as well? Like following up on these mRNA vaccines, like how much antibody testing has been done in people to actually see what kind of resistance they've developed? Uh, I don't know whether the scientific community has done any, or whether we can actually go into a lab and just kind of test and see whether we are immune or not. Is that possible?
So the self-tests are not extremely reliable for personal use. Most of the work has been done this type of neutralize. So yes, that has been done. These are called these neutralization assays, where basically you take the serum from someone who is either infected or has been vaccinated, and then you test it either against the virus or what is called a pseudotype virus, where they take the shell, the coating of the virus, and they put it on another harmless virus, because you can't work with a virus all the time. It's just very highly infectious and deadly. Right. So they have like these systems where they do that. And they tested it out, and they can see the levels of antibodies. Obviously, it's different in different people, but these mRNA vaccines are absolutely fantastic in the amount of antibodies that they generate, that basically, even when the virus mutates a little bit and the antibodies don't recognize them as well, they are in such a high number that they are still adequate to stop the virus. So that's the sort of exciting thing about this platform. I wrote a piece in Hindustan Times about the future of mRNA vaccines and why they're so amazing. And the other aspect of it is that it is very much sort of like creating software. It is plug and play, where you don't have to, the traditional vaccine was you created and you amassed a large number of this infectious virus, and then you either inactivated it or you weakened it by passing it. So it was very laborious. This is basically, they take the genetic material, they have the sequence, they design it in a lab, they test it out. You can go through multiple iterative processes to basically refine it and make the best vaccine. And then you can, and then you go through manufacturing. So, and it's a very sort of, it's basically just the message that you want antibodies created against. So it's like this highly concentrated message that you have. And I think that's going to be the future of a lot of vaccines.
Yeah, but what about like us as individuals? Like we have our own immunity, right? So, maybe like we all thought, all of us Indians thought like, yeah, maybe we're just like, we've just got good immunity. That's why we flattened the curve. And then lo and behold, we're in our second wave, right? We've generated these mutants. So it's just that, maybe can we test on our own? No, we can't test for.
No, there is, you can get antibody tests, and that can,
right.
That may be helpful, but they're not very, very reliable. And then the other thing is the antibodies themselves are not going to, that's only one part of the immune system. They won't tell you about the other pieces of the immune system.
I see. Yeah, that's what Jimal's question was also like, can we get the rapid antigen test and find out about antibodies? But you're saying that's not the whole story of immunity. I see. We have one last question from Neelab. Neelab, do you want to ask your question? If you're there. Okay, so his question is, I happen to have one more question. What is your take on the recent findings by Rolf Marschalek regarding the AstraZeneca vaccine, the blood clots are the result of the adenovirus vector? Right, that just came in the news, I think, recently.
Yeah, so this just came out, I think, in the last 24 hours. Right. I have looked at it. I haven't really processed it. And I think we need to see some more actual data as opposed to a news article before we comment on this. But it is plausible based on the fact that it has also been observed for the J&J vaccine, which is also an adenovirus vector vaccine. So it's plausible, but it still maybe needs a week or 2 weeks of other people chiming in and some data and some preprints on medRxiv or bioRxiv.
So there's a last question. Vaccine has any validity, or is it effective for life? Like how long is it effective for?
the effectiveness of the vaccine is unknown right now. And like I said, like it will probably keep you, once you get vaccinated, keep you out of the hospital. But so it depends on what you define by effectiveness. You could still get infected. And nobody was, even they were saying, the doctors were saying, like, I got vaccinated and that saved my life, but I still got mild COVID.
Right, right. All right. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful and enlightening conversation. And I'm sure our audience is also more educated as a result of it. We look forward to having you on with us again. And hopefully we'll be meeting in better times and not such a, where the situation is so harsh outside. So thank you again. And we look forward to meeting you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thanks to both of you, because today we had a lot of personal questions and we were looking for some expert. So thank you, Dr. Anirban, for coming and clarifying. Because even after reading, when you meet somebody face to face and ask a question and get an answer, that is something different. So we are grateful to you for that.
No. Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Please take care, everyone, and thank you.